Hello everyone and welcome to ACAD-05, where we are going to discuss the different flight rules. So we're going to learn to describe IFR and VFR and how they pertain to DCS. So what are they exactly? Well, we have two different sets of flight rules. We have visual flight rules, or VFR, which is flight conducted with visual by looking outside the cockpit effectively, typically with visual reference to the surface, and this is not reliant on GPS or INS or radar vectors. Then we also have the instrument flight rules, or IFR, which is flight conducted with, flight conducted only with reference to instruments. And typically, it's a lot easier for us if flight plans are filed when a pilot operates under IFR, but that is not necessary in DCS. So let's talk about when we can apply VFR specifically to start with. So because we are navigating by looking outside the cockpit, we have specific weather conditions that we have to adhere to. So above 3,000 feet above ground level, aircraft need to maintain 1,500 meters horizontally from clouds, 1,000 feet vertically from clouds, and 5 kilometers visibility. Then below 3,000 feet above ground level, they just need to be clear of clouds and with continuous sight of the surface. Now this only applies when pilots are not within Class Alpha airspace, where VFR is not allowed. So pilots flying under VFR can conduct flight solely with using visual reference points, or VRPs, but they will have to report their position to ATSA when necessary or when asked to, and if they are operating outside controlled airspace, would require clearance to transit and enter certain airspaces. Let's have a quick think about the different pros and cons of VFR. The biggest pro is that pilots can fly fairly freely with minimal restrictions on where they can fly, and generally without constantly having to request new clearances from air traffic control. Pilots also maintain visual separation with each other and therefore have responsibility for a separation, which makes it far easier to conduct things like formation flights. And pilots are able to practice traffic patterns, so being able to practice lots of landings and approaches in quick succession, which is quite common at uncontrolled airfields. However, controllers are not required to provide VFR aircraft certain services in certain airspaces. More on that later, and in different ACADs. So if a controller's workload is high, they can decline requests from a VFR aircraft. With that, pilots are responsible for their own navigation, and therefore might not be able to accept certain clearances, as it would take them into a cloud, for example. And with that, pilots cannot operate in adverse weather or visibility, and such conditions could force them to declare an emergency if they cannot switch to instrument flight. Speaking of which, let's talk about instrument flight rules. So IFR can be conducted in zero visibility because reference to the outside is not required, and they can fly solely with reference to their instruments. This is typically the flight rules which airliners would fly in the real world. When IFR procedures are followed properly, the terrain separation should never be a concern, as all of the altitudes and lateral navigation procedures will take you well clear of any terrain. Because of these procedures, IFR typically is not carried out in detail without a controller there, as things like radar vectors can be necessary to fly under IFR properly. And because of its complexity, pilots should but also do not have to file a flight plan before their flight, just to let air traffic control know exactly what they would like to do. Pros and cons of instrument flight rules. So pilots can receive constant air traffic control support and are not necessarily responsible for traffic separation or terrain separation, which is true in controlled airspace. Pilots can operate in adverse weather conditions and low visibility, which can be particularly useful at times. The pilots can receive detailed navigational support from a controller and generally receive much more help from a controller. VFR pilots are typically much more on their own. Because IFR procedures have to be followed more or less by the letter, IFR tends to be slightly more restrictive, but it is also significantly more efficient for us to deal with as controllers. Then another con is that pilots have to have the necessary equipment installed in their aircraft. For example, the DCS F-18 Hornet does not have the equipment necessary for an ILS or instrument landing system approach, so we have to talk them down using a precision approach radar. But there will be more detail on these instrument approaches in future ACADs. And also, pilots are typically advised to file flight plans before flying, just to give us controllers more information about what they are planning to do and things like that. And this can at some times be troublesome. However, we do not require it because it's only DCS. So, when the conditions are appropriate for VFR flying, we call this Visual Meteorological Conditions, or VMC. And when the conditions are below VMC, we call this Instrument Meteorological Conditions, or IMC, which is where IFR flight has to be conducted. So in VMC, you can fly both VFR or IFR, but in IMC, you have to be IFR. And there are some examples of both IMC and VMC days. So to summarize, we looked at the definitions of visual and instrument flight rules and some pros and cons of each. And we also looked at the applications of the different flight rules in different airspaces and meteorological conditions, and we spoke about VMC and IMC. Hopefully that was useful to you guys.